The morning sun cast long shadows across the twisted metal and scorched concrete of Pearl Harbor, as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by towers of intercepted Japanese messages. It was late April 1942, and the cryptanalyst hadn't seen his family in weeks. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but his mind was sharper than ever. Something big was coming. He could feel it in the patterns of enemy communications, in the increased radio traffic that flowed through Station Hypo, like a river threatening to burst its banks. Outside his windowless office in the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building, the Pacific Fleet was a shadow of its former self. 4 battleships lay on the harbor bottom. Hundreds of aircraft had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Americans had died on that infamous December morning. The Japanese had struck with precision and overwhelming force, leaving America's Pacific defenses in ruins. But Rochefort knew something the Japanese didn't. The Americans weren't beaten. They were learning, adapting, and preparing to strike back. "Sir?" "Another intercept from the Japanese 4th Fleet," said one of his cryptanalysts, placing a freshly decoded message on Rochefort's cluttered desk. The young officer's face showed the strain of endless hours spent wrestling with the enemy's naval code. "They're requesting additional supplies for something called Operation MI. Rochefort's tired eyes suddenly blazed with intensity. For weeks, his team had been tracking fragments of a massive Japanese operation. The enemy was planning something that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor. But where? When? The coded designation AF appeared repeatedly in the intercepts, taunting them with its mystery. If they could crack this puzzle, they might turn the tide of the entire war. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the window of his headquarters, gazing out at the salvage crews still working to raise the sunken battleships. The white-haired Texan had taken command of the Pacific Fleet at its darkest hour, inheriting a demoralized force and an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Behind him, his intelligence officer, Commander Edwin Layton, cleared his throat nervously. "Admiral Rochefort's team believes they've identified a pattern in the Japanese communications. Layton reported something major is being planned for early June. The scale suggests it's their largest operation since the war began." Nimitz turned from the window, his ice-blue eyes focused intently on Layton. The Admiral had learned to trust his intelligence officers even when their conclusions seemed impossible. Unlike many senior commanders who dismissed code reading as unreliable guesswork, Nimitz understood that information was the most powerful weapon in modern warfare. "How certain are they?" Nimitz asked, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Every decision he made could mean life or death for thousands of sailors and Marines." "Rochefort stakes his career on it, sir," Layton replied without hesitation. "He believes the target is somewhere in the Central Pacific. His team is working around the clock to pinpoint the exact location." The Admiral nodded slowly. If Rochefort was right, this could be the opportunity they desperately needed. The Japanese had been advancing across the Pacific like a tidal wave, capturing island after island, building an empire that stretched from the home islands to the shores of Australia. But every empire had its limits, and perhaps the enemy was finally overreaching. Down in the cryptanalysis center, Rochefort Ford's team worked with feverish intensity. The basement room was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Banks of IBM tabulating machines clattered endlessly, sorting through thousands of code groups. Men and women in rumpled uniforms pored over worksheets, searching for patterns in the seemingly random characters. "I've got something," announced Lieutenant Commander Wesley Ham Wright, one of Rochefort's top CRIP analysts. "The Japanese keep referencing water desalination equipment for AF. Why would they need special water supplies for a major naval base?" Rochefort felt the pieces clicking into place. A location that would need additional water supplies, somewhere strategically important enough to warrant a massive operation. His mind raced through the possibilities, and suddenly he knew it had to be Midway at the tiny American outpost that guarded the approaches to Hawaii. One of his subordinates, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, proposed an ingenious plan. "What if we have Midway report water supply problems? If the Japanese mention it in their coded traffic, we'll know AF is Midway." "Get me a secure line to Layton," Rochefort ordered. "Tell Midway to send an emergency message in plain language saying their water distillation plant has broken down." Meanwhile, aboard the carrier USS Enterprise, Admiral William Bull Halley lay in sickbay, his body ravaged by a severe case of dermatitis. The aggressive commander who had led the early carrier raids against Japanese-held islands was now too ill to stand. His task force was about to sail into the most important battle of the war, and he wouldn't be leading it. "Bill, you look like hell," said Admiral Raymond Spruant, visiting his old friend. The two men were opposites in many ways. Holly was bold and instinctive, while Spruance was calculating and methodical, but they shared a deep respect for each other and an unshakable determination to defeat Japan. "Ray, I'm giving you my command," Holly said weakly. "Take my boys and hit those bastards hard. They trust you, and so do I." Spruant nodded solemnly. He had never led carriers in combat before, but he understood the principles of naval warfare better than almost anyone. More importantly, he knew how to listen to his subordinates and make decisions based on facts rather than emotion. These qualities would soon be tested in ways no one could imagine. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon inspected his ragtag collection of aircraft. The tiny Atoll's air group was a mixed bag of obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters already proven inferior to the Japanese Zero, alongside a handful of newer Wildcat fighters and various bombers. His pilots were mostly green, fresh from training with little combat experience. "Colonel, are we really expected to stop the Japanese Navy with these?" asked Major Lofton Henderson, gesturing at the lined-up Buffaloes. The Marine aviator knew the reputation of these planes, nicknamed flying coffins by their pilots. "We'll stop them or die trying," Shannon replied grimly. "Every minute we can delay them gives the Navy a better chance to hit their carriers. That's our job, Major. Buy time with everything we've got." Back at Pearl Harbor, confirmation came through that electrified Rochefort's team. Japanese intelligence had reported in their coded messages that AF was experiencing water shortages. The target was definitely Midway. Armed with this crucial intelligence, Nimitz called his senior commanders to an urgent meeting. "Gentlemen, we know where they're going and approximately when," Nimitz announced to the assembled officers. "The Japanese are sending at least 4 carriers to attack Midway in early June. This is our chance to ambush them." Captain Miles Browning, Holly's chief of staff who would now serve under Spruant, studied the intelligence reports. "Sir, our pilots are reporting at least 6 Japanese carriers operational. If they bring them all, they won't," Nimitz interrupted with quiet confidence. "Our intelligence indicates they're splitting their forces. 2 carriers are heading for the Aleutians as a diversion. That leaves 4 for Midway, and we'll be waiting with 3. The mathematics were still daunting. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids. Their pilots were the best in the world with years of combat experience. The American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, had brave crews but far less experience. Moreover, Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea and was limping back to Pearl Harbor. "How long to repair Yorktown?" Nimitz asked, turning to his maintenance officer. 3 months minimum, Admiral." She took bomb hits that went deep into her structure. "There's significant damage to her flight deck and fuel systems." "You have 3 days, Nimitz said flatly. "Whatever it takes. I want that ship operational and sailing with the others." The maintenance officer's jaw dropped, but he saw the determination in Nimitz's eyes. "Yes, sir. We'll work around the clock." As May drew to a close, Pearl Harbor became a hive of desperate activity. 400 workers swarmed over Yorktown, welding, hammering, and installing new equipment. The repairs that should have taken months were compressed into 72 hours of superhuman effort. Men worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, knowing that every rivet they drove, every plate they welded might make the difference between victory and defeat. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one of the Navy's premier fighter tacticians, gathered his pilots aboard Yorktown. He had developed new tactics specifically to counter the superior maneuverability of the Japanese Zero, which had dominated every aerial engagement so far. "Listen up," Thatch addressed his young aviators. "The Zero can outturn us, outclimb us, and it's faster, but it's lightly built. Our Wildcats can take punishment and keep flying. We're going to use a new formation I call the Thatch Weave. Work in pairs, cover each other, and never try to dogfight a Zero one-on-one." Among the pilots was Anen George Gay, fresh from flight school with barely 300 hours of flight time. The young Texan tried to hide his nervousness as Thatch explained how they would attack the Japanese fleet. The torpedo bombers would go in low and slow, perfect targets for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft. Fire. Everyone knew it was practically a suicide mission, but no one voiced their fears. In the intelligence offices, analysts worked to piece together the complete Japanese order of battle. They knew Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, The architect of Pearl Harbor was personally commanding the operation. The strike force would be led by Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded at Pearl Harbor. The intelligence painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese confidence. They were coming to finish what they had started 6 months earlier. "They're bringing everything," reported one of Nimitz's planning officers. "Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports with invasion troops. They intend to take Midway and use it as a base for further operations against Hawaii." "Let them come," Nimitz responded calmly. "The bigger the force, the more they have to lose." On May 28th, Task Force 16, centered on Enterprise and Hornet under Spruant's command, slipped out of Pearl Harbor. The carriers were screened by cruisers and destroyers, their crews at battle stations. 2 days later, on May 30th, Yorktown followed, her hull still bearing fresh welds and patches. The 3 carriers would rendezvous northeast of Midway at a position designated Point Luck, perfectly positioned to ambush the approaching Japanese. Aboard Enterprise, Spruant studied the latest intelligence updates with his staff. The quiet admiral was known for his analytical mind and careful planning. Unlike the impulsive Halsey, Spruant calculated every move, considering all possibilities before making decisions. "The Japanese expect to achieve surprise," Spruant told his staff. "They believe our carriers are still in the South Pacific or back at Pearl Harbor. That overconfidence is our greatest advantage. We must use it wisely." Commander Wade McClusky, commanding Enterprise's air group, prepared his pilots for what lay ahead. A veteran naval aviator, McClusky understood both the capabilities and limitations of his aircraft and men. "When we find their carriers, we hit them with everything we've got," McClusky briefed his squadron commanders. "The dive bombers will attack from high altitude while the torpedo planes go in low. Fighter cover will be limited, so speed and surprise are essential." Among McClusky's pilots was Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6. Best was known for his exceptional accuracy in dive bombing, a skill that would soon prove crucial. He gathered his own pilots for a more detailed briefing. "Remember, we're looking for their carriers, not the battleships or cruisers," Best emphasized. "I don't care how tempting the other targets look. We sink their carriers and we win this war." As May turned to June, both fleets moved toward their fateful encounter. The Americans had positioned themselves perfectly thanks to their code-breaking success, but intelligence was only part of the equation. The coming battle would be decided by the skill and courage of the pilots, the decisions of commanders under extreme pressure, and the thin margin between victory and disaster that characterized carrier warfare. On Midway itself, preparations reached a fever pitch. Every available aircraft was armed and fueled. Marines dug defensive positions in the coral sand. Radar operators scanned the skies continuously, knowing that the first warning of the Japanese approach would come from their screens. The garrison knew they were vastly outnumbered, but they also knew their role. Hold out long enough for the Navy to strike the enemy carriers. Commander Cyril Simard, Midway's senior officer, made a final inspection of the defenses. The Atolle's 2 small islands were packed with ammunition, fuel tanks, and aircraft. One well-placed bomb could turn the entire base into an inferno, but there was no choice. Everything depended on Midway holding out long enough for the carriers to do their work. As darkness fell on June 3, 1942, American PBY Catalina patrol planes spread out from Midway in long search patterns. These slow, ungainly aircraft would be the first to spot the approaching enemy. Their crews knew that making contact with the Japanese fleet meant almost certain death, as the lumbering patrol planes were easy prey for Zero fighters. But finding the enemy was worth any sacrifice. At 0900 on June 3rd, Ian and Jack Reed, piloting a PBY, spotted ships on the horizon. Sighted main body, he radioed, bearing 262, distant 700 miles. The Japanese invasion force had been found, but the carriers remained hidden. That afternoon, 9 B-7s from Midway attacked the invasion convoy but scored no hits. 4 PBYs equipped with torpedoes attempted a night attack, claiming 1 hit. While these attacks caused no significant damage, they alerted the Japanese that the Americans knew they were coming. At Aero 300 on June 4th, relay sounded aboard the American carriers. In ready rooms, pilots received final briefings and wrote last letters home. Mechanics made final checks on aircraft. Ordnance crews loaded bombs and torpedoes. 3 carriers with barely 230 aircraft were about to take on the pride of the Japanese Navy. The odds were steep, but the Americans had advantages. They knew the enemy was coming. They knew where to find them, and they had commanders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, in overall command aboard Yorktown, made the decision that would govern American tactics for the coming battle. Rather than keeping his carriers together for mutual protection, he would operate them separately, reducing the risk of all three being caught together. It was a gamble, but the entire operation was a gamble on a massive scale. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, the stage was set for one of the most decisive battles in naval history. The Japanese came in supreme confidence, expecting to catch the Americans by surprise. Instead, they were sailing into a carefully prepared trap. The U.S. Navy, battered but not broken at Pearl Harbor, was about to demonstrate that American determination and ingenuity could overcome even the most daunting odds. At 04:30 hours on June 4th, the pre-dawn darkness over Midway was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. Lieutenant Commander Doichi Tamaga led 108 Japanese aircraft from the four carriers toward their target. The attack force included 36 torpedo bombers carrying conventional bombs for ground attack, 36 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters for escort. As they formed up in the darkness, not one of the Japanese aviators suspected that American carriers lurked nearby, waiting. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming strike at 0552. Many planes bearing 320 degrees, distance 93 miles, the operator reported, his voice steady despite his racing heart. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll. Marines ran to their battle stations while pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Every flyable plane on Midway had to get airborne immediately or risk destruction on the ground. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 into the dawn sky, including his obsolete Buffalo fighters, knowing they were heading into a massacre. The Buffalo was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than the Zero, but Henderson's Marines had absolute determination to protect their base at any cost. "Enemy fighters 12 tower high," the radio crackled with warnings as the Marines met the incoming strike force head-on. The Zeros pounced on the American fighters like hawks among pigeons. Within minutes, the sky was filled with burning American planes spiraling toward the ocean. Henderson's aircraft was among those shot down as he led his squadron's dive bombers in their attack. But the Marine sacrifice wasn't in vain. Their attack disrupted the Japanese formation and forced the bombers to take evasive action. More importantly, it bought precious time for Midway's bomber force to clear the island and head for the Japanese fleet, whose position had been reported by searching PBY patrol planes. At 0630, Tominaga's force reached Midway and began their attack runs. Bombs rained down on the airfield, fuel tanks, and defensive positions. The island's anti-aircraft guns blazed away, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. A direct hit on the power station knocked out Midway's radar. Another bomb set the fuel tanks ablaze, sending thick columns of smoke into the morning sky. But as Tominaga circled to assess the damage, he realized the attack had failed in its primary objective. The runways were cratered but repairable. Many defensive positions remained intact. Most critically, they had destroyed few aircraft on the ground because the Americans had gotten them airborne in time. Tamaga radioed back to Admiral Nagumo. "There is need for a second attack wave." This message would trigger a chain of decisions that would determine the battle's outcome. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a dilemma. He had held back 93 aircraft armed with anti-ship weapons, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs in case American ships appeared. Should he rearm them with ground attack weapons for a second strike on Midway, or keep them ready for naval targets? At 7:15, Nagumo made his fateful decision: rearm the aircraft with bombs for land attack. Crews immediately began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with conventional bombs. It was dangerous work on crowded hangar decks with armed ordnance being moved around volatile aviation fuel and ammunition. Unknown to Nagumo, 200 km to the northeast, American carriers were already launching their strikes. Admiral Sprunt, commanding Enterprise and Hornet, had made the crucial decision to launch everything he had at maximum range. It was a calculated risk. His planes would barely have enough fuel to return, but it would catch the Japanese at their most vulnerable moment. "Pilots, man your planes," the order echoed across the American flight decks. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led,